Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome this week to the show Katrina Menard. She is the State Policy Fellow at the Public Assets Institute in Montpelier. I'm so glad you're here today, Katrina.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for diving into what I think for many people can be a very emotional subject, which is wages and wages in Vermont. Um, before we jump in though, I just want to give an apology or beg the indulgence of listeners. We are recording this on Tuesday the 19th, and I don't know about everyone else, but it was 50 degrees in my house a couple days ago. It's 90 now. Windows are open. Fan is on. I apologize if there's background noise.
I 100% have flies just buzzing around in this room. So,
One thing I noticed, Katrina, I don't know about you, but whenever I visit other places in the country or when I've traveled abroad, I don't know, the outside world just doesn't seem to come in
Mhm.
other places in the world like it does in Vermont. Vermont's kind of special like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had a family member way back 2003. They bought a house in Stratford, and the woman at the time, the owner, unbeknownst to them, had been feeding the chipmunks inside. So
Oh,
for a period of months after purchasing it, there were just chipmunks that would come inside constantly. And that is where my fear of chipmunks definitely stems from.
I can see that. They're fast and they like to climb up pant legs.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Well, Katrina, I'd love to dive into that issue of wages. Um, I think listeners will know that I've been asking a lot of guests lately. I'm hearing from folks that it's just hard to make it in Vermont.
Mhm.
And I think for some people that's wages. And I would love to hear from you any trends that you are seeing around wages and how that might roll out to a worker in Vermont.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a trend that has been solidifying over the last 50 years. We see some blips here and there, but it's really held strong. And what we're seeing is that the lowest earners in Vermont, their wages are not growing as fast as those at the top. So that bottom 10th percentile of earners, they're seeing growth of about 25%. Those at the top 90th percentile, are seeing growth around 27%. And this doesn't sound like a substantial difference, but when you think about where they started, it translates to about $20,000 more in growth than the lowest wages. And this is obviously pretty substantial. This was over the last 20 years. So $20,000 in growth for the highest rather than the lowest over the last 20 years. What this means for the lowest wage earners is that, they were making $12 an hour 20 years ago, and now they're making $15 an hour. That's not a substantial amount of growth. And it means, annually, that's about $31,000. I think a lot of us know that's really tough to live off of in
Yeah.
Vermont. There's a really good state report. It's the Basic Needs Budget. It's produced by the Joint Fiscal Office, and it's Vermont specific. It looks at what would a Vermonter need to make to be able to afford to live here to meet their basic needs. And it looks at costs like housing, healthcare, food, transportation, clothing, every essential that you would need. It looks at different family types. It looks at number of kids, number of earners, whether you're an individual. And it's found that for an individual in shared housing, you would need $16,000 more than what the lowest earners are making to be able to meet your basic needs. So it's really lagging behind what's needed.
Hmm. Yeah, listeners, that's a very interesting and illuminating report. I will link to it in the show notes of this episode. If anyone wants to peruse it, you can also find it on the Joint Fiscal Office's website. Um, which reminds me, just quickly, Katrina, if you know this, the basic need uh, hourly wage
Yeah.
for folks in Vermont in an urban area, according to the budget, is about just under $20, $19 and change.
Yeah.
But I go elsewhere for sources and I see this phrase, the living wage.
Mhm.
Is that the same thing or are they slightly different?
That's a good question. It depends on the source that you're looking at. So, like I said, with the basic needs report, that's Vermont specific. There's also measures like the federal poverty level,
Hmm.
which is very different. I forget specifically what the figure is, but it's substantially below what they consider a livable wage in Vermont. So, it's a much lower percentage of Vermonters that are considered living in poverty versus those who can actually meet their basic needs. But as you said, it's about $20 for an individual who's living in shared housing. And that's about, a $5 gap between what people are currently making at the bottom versus what's needed. And at the same time, those at the highest level are making about $60 an hour. So when we talk about that gap again, that growth in that alligator mouth, it's not just that the growth rates are different, that it's growing faster at the top. It's also the difference between this nominal amount, this, $60 an hour versus 15. And at the same time, I do want to point out that Vermont's minimum wage right now is $14.42, I believe. It has been growing, but it's still substantially below what's considered this livable wage. And not only that, it's also been falling behind other states. So what we're seeing is that Vermont's minimum wage is actually lower than every other New England state except for New Hampshire, which follows the federal minimum wage, which I think is still like $7 something,
That
really,
sounds right. Yeah.
really low. But, all this to say, even with a growing, albeit slowly, minimum wage, it's certainly not keeping up, one, with other New England states, but two, with what's needed to be able to afford to live in Vermont. So I think, raising the minimum wage is one way to start to close this gap. Um, you could raise it to the livable wage. You could raise it even higher. Why not?
It's a human created thing, so it's a human thing we can change.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting talking about the minimum wage, Katrina, because when a few years ago, when when the legislature voted to raise the minimum wage and to, if I remember correctly, do it in increments, um, there were a number of folks panicking that raising the minimum wage would start pulling down other wages. In fact, I
Mhm.
think it was Representative Scott Beck was on last week's show, and he mentioned to me that he talks to employers who say because they have to pay such a high minimum wage, they
Mhm.
don't pay their other workers as large a wage. Um, okay, help me understand that.
Well, and I would also just say, there's kind of two sides to this, right? When you go to apply for a job, you look at the wages, you look at the salary, and you look at the benefits. There's another way to help employers that could kind of help to offset this, if they are lowering costs or lowering wages, excuse me, for some of their other workers, there are other ways to help these businesses. For example, I think one thing we talk about so much in Vermont, for good reason, is health insurance. It has been so expensive. We are seeing massive federal cuts. We're seeing federal cuts to Medicaid. They're expected to cause 16,000 Vermonters to lose their insurance. A lot of these changes haven't even been implemented yet. I think the work requirements maybe start in 2027. So I think it's just going to get worse. We're also seeing things like the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credit for the Affordable Care Act. And essentially, what this was, for people making over a certain amount, it provided them a stipend, it helped them afford their monthly premium. And, 30,000 Vermonters or so received assistance through this premium tax credit. So it was a really important way for Vermonters to both access health insurance, but to also not have to use their wages getting health insurance, right? So it's kind of a win-win. You have more of your wages that you're able to keep. So with the expiration of these tax credits, this is certainly a cost that's gone up. I think speaking from a personal lens, I received the enhanced premium tax credits last year. Um, I was pregnant at the time. My baby was due December 31st.
Aw.
It was a really tricky due date because with the enhanced premium tax credit, I could easily afford insurance, again, $50 a month. Following the expiration of this tax credit, my premiums were going up to $1,000 a month.
From
And it
$50 to 1,000.
$50 to 1,000. It didn't feel super feasible for me on top of paying hospital bills, my mortgage, medical bills. It just it was a really tricky position to be in. And I know there are so many other Vermonters who are feeling this too. I think we have some sort of measure where we found that for a Vermonter making $63,000, their premiums would go up to be a quarter of their income or something like that following the expiration of the tax credits. So just really substantial portions of their income. And it costs about $65 million. So this is a gap that the state could fill if they chose to. And it would help employers, right? It helps people access health insurance. It helps people, not spend their minimal wages on having to, afford a basic necessity. So I
Mhm.
think that's another solution is not just looking at how can we increase wages? How can we get them up to a floor where things are accessible, a livable wage, $20 an hour, but also how can we help people access benefits? How can we have people access health insurance, which is, just such a big issue in Vermont, and it's only getting worse with the federal cuts.
Mhm. You and I were talking off camera, and you mentioned something that I had heard, but in general, if you compare Vermont's wages to its neighbors across New England, in general for the same job, Vermont's pays less.
Yes.
And I hear that a lot when I'm out reporting when businesses are trying to recruit workers. They're like, we have no housing and folks can get paid more if they just move to New Hampshire. It's kind of what I hear over and over again because I'm on that side of the state.
Mhm.
Um, do we know why Vermont's wages tend to drag behind other places? Is it the types of jobs we have? Is it, I don't know, curious.
It's a great question. As you said, the same job in Vermont generally pays less than that job in other states. There's also a question around whether we just have more lower paying jobs, which I think is also true, but
Hmm.
it really is that even within the same occupation, you're likely going to get paid less in Vermont again than in other states. And I think another thing that's really playing into this is this gap between growth in worker productivity and worker compensation. So we've looked at, over the last 25 years, how much productivity has grown in Vermont. And productivity in this case is total income generated per hour of work. We saw that over the last quarter century in Vermont, worker productivity grew by 47%. Compensation only grew by 34%. So
Hmm.
workers are, producing more, but they're getting less for it. They're not reaping the fruits of their labor as much. And it's really hard to say why specifically this is the case in Vermont. We know from national organizations like Economic Policy Institute that nationally, of course, we're seeing this nationally too, this growing gap between productivity and compensation. And nationally, some of it can be accounted to those additional funds going towards shareholders, executives, and corporate profits. I feel like we hear this story all the time. And, I don't know if we can say specifically whether that's the case in Vermont, but we are certainly seeing the same trend of more and more productive workers and not the same amount of growth in compensation. Workers getting paid less for the work that they're doing.
Hmm. Well, listeners, if you're not depressed now,
Sorry, that's my specialty.
well, it's a nugget though, because we have so many goals in our state around attracting more families, more babies, more housing, more jobs, lowering the taxes, all we protecting our environment. We have so many goals, and all of them, or it seems, mostly take money or other kinds of resources. And I just feel sometimes like in this state, we're playing a little bit of a chicken and an egg between what we actually have to work with and
Hmm.
what we want to do.
Yeah.
Welcome to household budgets everywhere, I suppose. But but I guess my first question to you with that is am I wrong? Am I the only one thinking this?
Certainly not. No, certainly not. I know we have talked about previously, like this choice between quality of life and
Hmm.
wages,
Yeah.
and seeing it as this dichotomy in Vermont. I certainly felt this way when I was wanting to move back to Vermont. I grew up here. I went down to DC to work there for several years. And coming back to Vermont was always a goal, but there was this question of, do I take a pay cut that's tens of thousands of dollars? In order to live where I love, where my family is, or do I stay and make more money? And for me at the time, it was a very easy decision. I didn't have a family at the time, so it was just me, myself, and I. I could live at home. I could shout out to my parents. I could live with my parents. It was great.
Hmm.
But obviously not everyone has that support, those options. And I think we've just kind of taken it for granted that there is this dichotomy. You can either have the quality of life or you can have the wages. And that's just not the case. There are policy levers that we can be pulling to have both. And again, this could be increasing our minimum wage, which really has fallen behind other New England states, which is not livable. It could mean, increasing access to benefits. One thing that I did want to bring up, we've covered wages to a degree. We've covered that lower earners in Vermont are just falling further and further behind compared to the highest earners. That's part of it. The other part of the affordability crisis is costs. So what we saw when we looked at data from 2023 is that wages in Vermont were about 80% of the national average, but costs were right in line with the national average. And Vermont had, this gap between what people were earning and costs, what people could afford. It was one of the biggest gaps in the country. And I really think this is like the key to this whole affordability conversation is it's not just wages, low wages. It's not just high costs. It's that we have a gap. We have 80% of national average wages, but our costs are right in line with the rest of the country. It's very hard to, again, with jobs that are paying less in Vermont than, the same job in another state, it's harder to get access to afford basic necessities than it would be in other states because of this gap. And I think that's such a big issue. And, I think the other piece of this is public supports. Public supports, as we've discussed, can certainly help to close this gap. Um, Even before the federal cuts, they weren't going far enough. And we could see this, with the housing sector, for example. We saw homelessness triple between 2019 and 2024. We saw the number of unsheltered homeless people skyrocket. Unsheltered meaning, living in a tent, living in a car. So we were already seeing people falling through the cracks despite public investments. And now we're seeing federal cuts. We're seeing giant cuts to Medicaid, giant cuts to food assistance. We're seeing, the federal workers, all the layoffs, which I'm happy to get into as well with what we're seeing in Vermont for that. Um, but they already weren't going far enough. Now we're seeing more, more cuts. And, I think there is an opportunity for the state to sort of help fill that, um, especially with things like housing and healthcare. Again, the two of the biggest expenses, housing is usually a family's largest expense. We looked at housing costs in our State of Working Vermont report, and we found some pretty incredible things. For example, housing costs aren't growing at rates that incomes are keeping up with. I think we all feel that, we all see that, but there's actually data to back that up. The number of homes valued at $300,000 or more doubled in 5 years from 2019 to 2024. So pre-COVID to 2024. And the median value jumped by $120,000 to over $350,000. So, in other words, this is a 55% increase in the cost of housing. And then median household income has only gone up 15%. So I feel like the whole theme of this is just growing gaps, like growing divides. We're seeing over and over and over. Going back to median household income, for someone making median household income in 2019, they had access to about half of homes in Vermont. About half of homes were, considered affordable to them,
Mhm.
meaning they weren't spending more than a third of their income on housing.
Right.
Now it's about a third. So it's
Mm.
pretty, it's shrinking, of course. And that's not to mention those who are earning the least, what kind of housing they have access to, not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of quality. Sure, maybe there's a handful of affordable homes. Of course, it's not enough for, the portion of Vermonters that make those low wages. But does the housing have heat? Does the housing have a roof that works? Right? So it's two things. It's not just cost, it's also quality. And it's also with renting. So we saw 2024, I believe. I think it was about three-quarters of rentals cost over $1,000 a month compared to under half in 2019. And the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they put out a really great report every year that looks at what minimum wage earners could afford to rent in each state. In Vermont, perhaps unsurprisingly, two people at minimum wage, they can't afford a home at fair market rent. I think that's probably not surprising. But what could be surprising is that they fall short by about $25,000 a year. And just to clarify, fair market rent is, the price level at which 40% of rentals in the area are affordable.
Mhm.
So it's home ownership, it's renting. I feel like I'm just being so depressing this whole time. It's fixable, you guys. It's fixable.
It is fixable, and after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about fixes, but I do want to just sort of circle back and put a pin in or a little flag on quality of housing because I'm really surprised when I talk to housing folks, whether they're contractors or they're housing experts, the amount of housing we have in Vermont that most people would not want to live in. I'll just put
Mhm.
it very straight like that is higher than I think most people realize. And you're right, may not have heat, may not have great water, may not have could have things like mold
Yeah.
or dampness or other issues that are actually costing the homeowner or the renter more, but it may also be impacting their health um, as well. And I think we can't forget that because where
Yeah.
you live, I'm a feng shui practitioner. Where you live, like it matters. That's
Yeah.
your relationship between yourself and your environment, and you you impact each other for better or
Yeah.
for worse.
It absolutely matters. And, since COVID, we've seen obviously a big increase in telecommuting. People are spending more and more time in their homes. We recently looked at data on telecommuting by sex. Pre-COVID, we saw that rates were about equal. Similar number of men and women worked from home. It skyrocketed during the pandemic. And since then, it's more likely that men have been going back to the office than women. Women have more frequently been continuing to telecommute, telework, work remotely, whereas men have returned to the office. So neither here nor there, really, rather than just to say, people are spending more and more time in their homes because we do now have these remote working capabilities. I
Hmm.
say as I'm working out of my kids' nursery.
Same, well, not a nurse. Well, my nursery probably is what most of my friends and family would say, but any last thoughts you want to leave listeners with for this part of the conversation before we head to break, Katrina?
I think my last thoughts would be, I've given you a lot of doom and gloom. We are seeing this growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. I think everyone is feeling that, but there's data to back that up. Another way to think about this is looking at income distribution, right? So the top 10% held 45% of income back in 2022, which left about 55% for the bottom 90%. So we're seeing like this continued snowballing gap. It's causing this affordability issue when you combine it with high costs or average costs for the country, but considering wages that are at 80% of the national level, it's hard to afford these things. But again, this is a choice. There are policy levers, whether it's raising the minimum wage, whether it's subsidizing healthcare, subsidizing access to food. There's ways to decrease this gap and make sure that people can choose to live here, choose to move back here, choose to stay here. You shouldn't have to leave Vermont to be able to afford to live. So there's options. It's a choice that we have this affordability crisis.
Katrina Menard, state policy fellow with the
I'll take
Public
the
Assets
senior.
Institute.
I'll take the senior title.
You'll take it. I just give you a promotion.
Thank you so much.
Hang tight, folks. We will be right back on WVEW LP Brattleboro after we hear from some underwriters. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with Katrina Menard, the State Policy Fellow with the Public Assets Institute in Montpelier. Welcome back, Katrina.
Thank you. I now go by senior policy fellow. So
That's right. I gave you a promotion in the
I
first
got a
half, so
promotion during the show. So I'm
I'll be
sticking with
sure to
it.
email your colleagues and say, just so you know, if you missed this. Before we dive back into our conversation on wages, I just want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of this show, sharing it with media centers around the state, and remind people that the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and no one else. So unfortunately, that means they may not take your new promotion, Katrina.
I'll try anyways, don't worry.
I'm very proud of you. Um, so in the first half of the show, we were talking about wages, Katrina, and how they might be rolling out differently in Vermont than in New England. And yes, many times I think we depressed ourselves and listeners very, very much. And we promised we were not going to depress you further, but unfortunately, I think we have to just a little bit. I'm sorry. I asked the question, so you can get mad at me. I noticed, Katrina, as we were talking about wages, we were talking about folks at the lower end of the income spectrum and those at the top end of the income spectrum. But we didn't spend a lot of time talking on about the middle class and how some of this might be showing up for those in the middle of the income spectrum. Uh, do you have thoughts? Is there anything there you can share with us?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. So previously we had discussed, there's this trend that we've been seeing really solidify over the last 50 years where we have the lowest earners in Vermont, those making 10th percentile wages, their wages growing slower than those at the top, those who are making 90th percentile wages, causing this growing gap. Those in the middle, so those at the 50th percentile, what we would think of as median wage earners, their wages are actually growing slower than both those at the top and the bottom. Um,
Sorry,
again,
folks.
yeah, sorry, all shrinking middle class. But again, even though it's slower growth, because they started out with higher wages, it is a larger dollar increase over time than those at the very bottom. But again, yeah, it's slower growth for those right in the middle than those at both the top, who are seeing the fastest growth, and at the bottom.
Okay. Oh joy. Um, in a way though, I'm a little curious because it does seem that many in the legislature have recognized that with costs and everything, even folks who might be earning what we would consider a solid middle class wage may not be able to afford many things in Vermont. So they have raised the income uh, level, thank you, for some programs. For example, the one that just happens to come to mind because I was a little late doing my taxes, so mumble mumble, oops. I got an extension from the IRS, so I'm okay. But the the program that allows folks to receive free tax preparation.
Mm.
Um, the income there is almost like 50,000 or something, I believe. Um, but I'm wondering, are there other policies that are working or not working for folks in the middle class?
Yeah, I mean, I think one success we've seen, and I'm not a childcare expert, but I think one success we've seen is the state childcare program. I think that reaches a lot of people. I think it makes childcare significantly more affordable for many, many, many families. But at the same time, I also think there are supports that are disappearing at the federal level,
Hmm.
especially or in some cases only for the middle class. So, for example, we talked about the enhanced premium tax credits. This was specifically for families earning over a certain percentage of, the federal poverty level, generally middle class families, and it expired in December. And I think it's having really substantial impacts on Vermonters. I can't remember if I said this before, but Vermont actually has the highest premium costs on the marketplace. So
Hmm.
healthcare, health insurance is very expensive in the state. And what we're seeing with this expiration of the premium tax credit, which was previously helping middle class families afford to pay their premium, what we're seeing is that an individual making $63,000, for example, would pay $15,000 for the benchmark plan. That's about a quarter of their income. And when you add that to, say you're spending 30% of your income on housing, you're already spending more than half of your income. It's just deeply unaffordable. And let's be real, even 30% for housing is a bit of a stretch these days. As we discussed, housing costs are just skyrocketing, going up 55% versus 15 for median family household income. Um, and then again, going back to the enhanced premium tax credit, another example would be for a family of four, if you're earning $130,000, they're seeing premium increases of $32,000 a year. So it's certainly paired not just this slower wage growth, but also disappearing supports for those who are middle income. And I think especially at the federal level right now.
And just to be clear, those increases are that you're talking about with healthcare, that the increases are just the premiums. We're not talking out of park pocket costs on top of that.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. That's just for premiums. And like I said, Vermont has the highest premium costs on the marketplace. So we're not in a great spot with the expiration of these tax credits. But again, this is something that is fixable. The state receives $65 million to expand these tax credits to cover middle income families. And if the state wanted to raise new revenue, um, to be able to build a coffer of 65 million, I think that's very doable. I think it's very doable to sort of fill this federal gap and provide the support for middle income families.
So, mm. I hear what you're saying, and I guess my devil's advocate question to that would be, where you talked about raising revenues, we've been talking so much as a state lately about our increasing property taxes
Mhm.
and what that means and who can afford that. And
Mhm.
should we be adding programs? Should we be adding more expenses at the state level or the municipal level? So I guess to me, I'm feeling a little bit of a push and pull between policy levers and again, affordability.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a very fair point. My colleague Annika is really the expert on this. She leads Fair Share Vermont. But I do think there is a bit of an untapped group right now in terms of taxation, which is the wealthiest Vermonters. We just saw a continuation of substantial tax cuts for the richest Vermonters. It's expected, to save them millions and millions and millions of dollars. The state can recoup those cuts at the federal level. The wealthiest Vermonters may not even see their taxes go up, but it does shift the funds to the state so that we can cover some of these costs. And again, my coworker Annika is the expert on this. Everyone go to her. She's great. She's got the pitch down. I don't.
Annika was on the show probably, gosh, it might be 2 years ago now, talking about Fair Share Vermont.
Yes, I
We
watched her
should
episode. It was great.
she was very, very good, and we may
Mhm.
need to have an update. But in the meantime, folks, Fair Share Vermont, the housing wage, Working Vermont Report, JFO basic needs, they're all going to be in the show notes at this point. Um, so okay, we've talked about some policy levers. We've talked about some data, and I'm wondering, let's talk about myths. Do we have myths in our um, state economy or around wages that you might want to touch on?
I think we kind of touched on this previously. I think sometimes there's more of a focus on one side of the coin when it comes to the affordability issue, whether it's low wages or high costs. Um, I think it's a myth that it's one or the other. I think it's really that combination, that gap between 80% national wages, 100% national prices. I think that's a big part of it. Um, we talked about this myth of choosing between quality of life and wages. I don't think that's a real thing. I think we can have it all, people. I think we can have it all. Um, this isn't so much a myth, and stop me if I already discussed this. My brain is like super sleep deprived from a 5-month old. But one thing we looked at recently is um, wages by sex, by educational
Hmm.
level. Did we discuss this?
No,
We
we
didn't,
did.
right?
We talked off camera, so I can tell while you're wondering.
Okay.
But no, we haven't talked here. So good.
Okay, thank
Bring
you.
that up.
Yeah, so one thing that we saw is that, across the educational spectrum, whether it was a worker with a high school degree or a worker with a professional degree, across the board, women were making less than men in Vermont. And we know that this is worse for Black women, Hispanic women, Native American women. This gap is only greater for them.
Hmm.
Vermont's kind of a funky place data-wise in that because our population is so small, the margins of errors for looking at um, certain subpopulations like Black women, the margins of error can be too high, so it can be hard to draw conclusions from some of the data. But looking at the national perspective, of course, we see these big gaps, especially for women of color. And it's only getting worse with some of the federal actions, like, the attacks on DEI initiatives, mass deportations, the gutting of the federal workforce, making it harder to access childcare. All of these are, again, creating this gap where we're seeing men across the board, regardless of education level, making more than women.
Hmm. And I can imagine all sorts of repercussions from that. But I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of what does that mean for an economy or a community when you have that type of gap based on sex.
That's a great question. I mean, I think we all feel that it's morally wrong, right?
Hmm.
But in terms of what it actually means for the economy, I think one thing that comes to mind, we're seeing a pretty significant drop in Vermont's workforce recently. We saw an increase from, following the COVID pandemic back up to, I think, maybe a record high in January 2025. And then it just a substantial drop off. We're seeing lowest number of workers in Vermont's workforce since 2016.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I do wonder, is that potentially tied to some of this wage gap issues we're seeing and some of these attacks on uh, federal level programs or even federal level actions that are making it harder for women to work?
Hmm. Well, I wonder too, like, what it means for households because a household with, let's say, a single dad and a household with a single mom, um, is that household with the single mom more likely to be in poverty than a
Yes.
household with a single dad? You're saying yes. So
Yeah.
then what does that mean for children? You're
Yeah.
having, and I go back to one of our state goals. We want more children in Vermont. But again, if someone's risking poverty, they may
Right.
not stick around.
No. Yeah. Or they may not choose to have more kids. I mean, this is a conversation I've been having with so many of my friends. We're in our early 30s. A lot of us are starting families. A lot of us just got married. And it is a decision. You have to think, can I afford to have kids? Me and my partner, we're able to have a kid because we have family in the area who can provide childcare. It means driving an hour each way to, access it, but there are so many barriers to being able to start a family. And I'm sure my friend group's not alone, but it's certainly a conversation we've been having with, I have one kid, can I afford two? I don't know. I don't know if I can. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we're restricted in this way.
Mhm.
Again, it's a choice.
It is a choice, but it's also a choice that the state seems to want to support.
Yeah,
So then how do you support that?
that would be great. State, let us have more kids. We want to. Make it easier. It's awesome. We love babies.
Babies are they are cute, you gotta
They're
admit.
pretty sweet. Yeah.
Except when they keep you up for 5 months in a row.
Yes. Yeah. Good
Um,
point.
you forgot about that. You were
Yeah.
too sleep deprived. You mentioned cuts at the federal level, and it made me think, and then you mentioned a drop in our workforce. So
Mhm.
it got me thinking, what about cuts to the federal workforce? How has that rolled out in Vermont, if at all?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because this is a question I've been asking myself. I think we generally think of federal jobs as higher paying, good benefits. You've got those federal benefits, they're great. And with these mass layoffs, with the voluntary resignations, or even just with people turning over because of this instability and this fear of being laid off at any time, it has impacted Vermont. So, what we've seen is between the end of fiscal year 2024, so the end of September 2024 to February 2026, we've seen a drop in roughly 600 federal workers in the state, which is about 11% of the total federal workforce in Vermont,
Hmm.
excluding the Postal Service, which isn't accounted for in this data. Um, it's the lowest number of federal workers that Vermont has had in at least over a decade. I think potentially, possibly ever, but we just don't have the data from the Office of Personnel Management to back that up. And I will say, we don't have a substantial portion of our overall workforce that's federal workers, but again, 600 workers, an 11% drop, that's pretty substantial. We don't know whether they were laid off. We don't have the reason for why these workers left or where they went. But yeah, it's pretty substantial. And Vermont's decline was about in line with the rest of the country. It was sort of right towards the middle, whereas the mountainous states out west had the biggest drops.
Hmm. Well, I think you raise a really good point, and it's a question mark I always have about the Vermont economy is one of the downsides. I wonder if one of our downsides, because we are so small, we lack all sorts of diversity.
Mm.
Diversity of jobs, diversity of wages, diversity of benefits. Not
Diversity
a
of
lot of,
housing.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
And so if these federal workers were on the higher income side of the spectrum with good benefits, what kind of jobs are being left?
Hmm.
And are they the type of jobs that people can thrive in as
Right.
far as professionally, financially, the whole nine yards?
Yeah. And one thing we did see previously and are still continuing to see is that the number of job openings per unemployed Vermonter is high. There
Mm,
are jobs, but it's a question of what are the quality of these jobs? What are the wages? What are the benefits? Are they really feasible for still continuing to live in Vermont and again, meet your basic needs, hitting that livable wage of $20 an hour? And in my opinion, that's an underestimate because that's specifically for someone living in shared housing.
right. Well, but speaking of housing, I can see how, again, our lack of housing may be stymieing us because let's say someone's living down here in Windham County and they
Hmm.
see a job they might like in Franklin County, Chittenden County, Lamoille County. That's a little too far to commute.
Hmm.
A lot of people around here do commute an hour, sometimes two, but
Hmm.
three, that's getting up there. And if you can't find housing in those communities, you're not going to take the job.
Well, and not to mention the cost of gas is skyrocketing. I mean,
Mm,
absolutely skyrocketing. When we talk about the other side of the affordability crisis, not just wages, but also costs. It's not just housing, it's not just healthcare. Of course, those are really big ones, but it's also energy costs. I mean, I recently became a homeowner, and when I got my first energy bill, it was like I looked like one of those cartoons where the eyes popped out of the skull. Oh my gosh. And they're so volatile, you can't plan for it. I mean,
mm-mm.
it's really bad. But yes, I do think it's very difficult to find housing near your job. I've heard anecdotally from a number of people who have turned down jobs because they couldn't find housing nearby. And I know, for my partner, he drives an hour each way to get to his job. So it's tough.
Mhm. Okay, we have just over 5 minutes.
Ooh.
Now that everyone is packing their suitcases and getting ready to leave because we've made them so sad about the place they love, let's dive a little bit into what can be done. You mentioned Fair Share Vermont, but are there other places where the state or municipalities could lower costs, find new revenue, maybe change policy just so that it works better for more people?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think Vermont, one of the best parts of Vermont is that it's such a tight community and people do want their neighbors to succeed. They want them to be able to exist in Vermont in the way that they can do so safely and affordably. But I really think it boils down to those main levers of raising the minimum wage. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm just going to keep it going. Raising the minimum wage so it's closer to the livable wage of $20 an hour. Again, Vermont has fallen behind. We have the lowest minimum wage in New England, besides New Hampshire. New Hampshire, if you're listening, raise your minimum wage. Like, that's too low. Just throwing it out there.
Well, it's funny you say that because living on a border community, when I talk to folks who tend to have the lower wage jobs, like in hospitality or something like that, a lot of their workforce is New Hampshire because
Mhm.
they're coming over the border. And granted, I don't have data to back this up, but anecdotally, if I said that right, yeah, folks from New Hampshire are coming over the border to get jobs because they pay better,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. So that's certainly part of it is raising the minimum wage, expanding these public supports, whether it's filling in the gap for the enhanced premium tax credit, filling in some of the gaps with, cuts to food assistance, housing. Housing is such a big one. Continuing to build these public supports is so necessary. I think there's also something to be said for strengthening labor laws and
Mm.
unionization, but I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not gonna
You're not
I'm
going
not
to
even gonna
dive deep.
try. I'm just gonna let that one sit.
People can ruminate on that one.
Yeah. Google
Um,
it, guys. Google it.
and oh, something you just said, and then my overheated brain just lost it. Um, hmm. What about on the side of economic development? I realize we're going a little bit outside your purview, so it's okay if you don't, if you can't answer this. Um, but I think about that, like, again, I'm going back to the mix of jobs, or actually what I'm going back to is my plow guy earlier in the year stopped by so we could talk about what he needed to charge this year and if I, you know, if I could afford it kind of thing. And so we were talking a few things through, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm doing some other things. So if you need this type of work or that type of work, give me a call." And I said, "Oh, what, why the change?" And he said, "Well, I'm retiring. So now I need my retirement Vermont job."
Mhm.
And I thought about that, just like how often we're cobbling things together to make jobs work. And on one hand, I'm really proud of us for
Mhm.
doing that, but on the other hand, I'm kind of like, does that mean something else isn't working?
Mhm.
So I'm just throwing that out there to see if it jiggles anything loose for you about, economic development and jobs and
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we covered a good chunk of it. I think part of it is making sure that people can have one job where they have a good wage and they don't have to cobble things together. I think part of it is that, having access to housing near where you work or, not having to turn down jobs because you can't find housing. I think that's part of it. Education costs, higher education. I think that's a big part of it too.
hmm.
I don't have any data on this. This is like, again, not really my area of expertise, but it does seem like perhaps that's contributing to it as well, where people have to sort of cobble together whatever they can because access to higher education is really out of reach for a lot of Vermonters. So I think that's maybe playing into it too. But again, I don't have a ton of data on that.
Well, and higher education doesn't necessarily have to be a four-year degree either. It could be a training
Exactly.
program. It could be a
Apprenticeship.
vocational program,
Yeah.
apprenticeship. And yeah, some of those are still too expensive for folks. I have
Yeah.
heard the same. Okay. We're just about out of time, Katrina. What would you like to leave listeners with?
I've depressed everyone so much. Let's see. What do I want
Well,
to,
well,
the
maybe
two
it
key
will
tidbits.
jazz them to like, let's
Don't
improve our
lose
economy.
hope. Like
Yes.
all of this is a decision. It's all fixable, I believe. I think there's so much opportunity, especially with federal tax cuts to recoup some of that money, get it to the state. Let's spend it on people. Let's spend it on programs. We live in the best state ever. That's my that's my personal opinion. I love this state, and I think there's like you said, and as we've discussed, we shouldn't have to choose between quality of life and wages. And it's something that we can fix. We can fix this. It's all doable through policies. Let's do it. Let's get it done.
I love that. And I will add my little bit of hope. As we were talking, I thought, well, and maybe this is slightly backhanded hope, but we're talking about something really hard and really depressing. And yet, like you said, Vermont is a great place to live, and so many people do love it. And they stay even if they're clinging by their fingernails. And so that's a lot of really great energy that
Mhm.
could expand and thrive. Um,
Yeah.
so we let's help it do that.
Yeah. We're here because we love it and it's a great community. We want to help each other. We want to help our neighbors. And I think it can be done through policy.
Katrina Menard of the Public Assets Institute, Senior Policy Fellow. We'll just leave it with that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This has been great.
If people want to find more of the Public Assets Institute's reports and information, where can they do that?
Go to the website. It's all there. Research and publications at Public Assets Institute. Just Google.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVED every Friday at 2 p.m. Wednesdays mornings as well is where we rebroadcast. BCTV, and of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Take care, folks, and have a good weekend.